Okay, so we're going to talk about HTML and CSS. So would anyone like to define either one or both of those terms?
HTML is hypertext markup language, and
Okay.
CSS is cascading style sheets. HTML was is like, it was initially designed to share scientific documents between people across the country, and then CSS is more for the styling of the elements.
Okay. So so HTML is a format for representing documents, and so it's basically just the structure. So there is some semantic meaning, or people try to impose semantic meaning on certain tags. So just like we've talked about binary trees, for example. So an HTML document is kind of like a tree where you have different nodes, which are elements, and they're connected to each other. So a node can have a child, and that child can have another child, and so on. So tomorrow or on Thursday, when we talk about the DOM manipulation, we'll talk more about that. Let me just check this real quick. Okay, sorry, one sec. Yeah. Okay, so so the HTML provides basically the overall structure of a document. And if you look at early, the very earliest web pages, they look like basically Craigslist. It's that kind of thing where it's not very exciting, but all of the content is there. CSS is a way of controlling the layout and adding colors and fonts and lots of other complex things, including animations, and there are media queries. So there are a lot of very advanced things you can do with CSS. We're not necessarily going to get very deep into all of that, but so that's a basic distinction. A common kind of metaphor is CSS. If you're building a house, CSS is like the frame, or sorry, HTML is the frame, and CSS is the the paint and the decorations and so on. So we could spend a lot of time. I mean, I guess we could spend a lot of time talking specifically about HTML and how it works and all the different tags and stuff. But I think it's better just to go into some examples. So I'm going to share my screen. And the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to make a curl request to example.com. So what did I get back? So I made a curl request to example.com, and then I get back some stuff. So what is this stuff?
HTML.
Yeah. So it's an HTML document. So I made a request to this server, and this server sent me an HTML document. Now, I'm looking at this HTML document just in my terminal, so it doesn't really look like a web page. It just looks like an HTML document. So when I use my browser instead of the command line, I get something like this. So this and this are exactly the same thing. So I made a request to the server returned me the same thing in both instances, but this is being rendered by my browser. So the browser obviously knows what to do with HTML and CSS, so it doesn't just display it kind of as text. but does some processing. So when I made this curl request, I can see exactly what I get back, this HTML document, but I can also, even though the browser is not displaying, it's not showing me the raw HTML, it's easy to access that. So I can go into the developer tools, which on a Mac is Option Command I, or you can right click. Also go here, and then what is it, tools, from here, yeah, more tools, developer tools, and here we can see here is at least part of this document. We can also go into sources, and we can look at the actual document that we got sent. So if we go to sources, you can see this is exactly what we see here. Okay, and then well, one of the nice things about this view in the elements is you can right click on this particular thing and inspect it, and it goes right here. So this example domain, I just right clicked on it and did inspect, and it will automatically basically pull this up. So this is H1. So what is this? The H1 something something / H1.
A heading tag.
Yeah, it's a, let's see. Yeah, so that's what it's a header tag. So so in general, this is a tag. So HTML has tags, and there's a hierarchical structure. So you can have tags, you can have tags within tags. So we can see here that we have an HTML tag. So this opening tag here, HTML, and the closing tag, which begins with a /. So this whole document is kind of one tag in a sense, right? This is an HTML document. This HTML node or document, however you want to think about it, has two children. It has a head child and it has a body child. You can look at the head. So the head also has a bunch of other tags. We don't need to worry too much about these. A lot of this is kind of boilerplate. The body has the actual content that will get displayed. And the body itself also has, so the body also has a child. So the body has a child, and this child is a div. So does anyone happen to know what a div is?
It's basically a divider for content or a container. So it's like a box to put things in.
Yeah, exactly. So it's basically, to a certain extent, all tags are the same. There are some differences, but a div is basically the most generic tag you can have. And we'll see it. I guess this doesn't happen so much anymore, but I think a couple of years ago, if you look at a site made with React a couple of years ago, you'll just see divs everywhere. It's just like div, 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 div. So it doesn't really, like, in terms of describing the semantic structure of a document, div is not necessarily all that helpful. So typically you want to, as much as possible, use things like H1 for headers, and P is a paragraph for text content, and headers and footers and things like that. But you can't just use divs for everything. So div, so here's another child. So we're, HTML, and then child body, and then child div. And then we've got another, so div has another child, which is this H1 tag. So H1 is a title. There are, I think, 6 or maybe more tags as they get increasingly smaller. So H1 is for like the major title, H2 would be subtitle, H3, and so on. And then P, this is a paragraph. So a P tag and a P tag can have some text content. So there's one P tag. Here's another P tag. And this P tag actually has another node inside of it. It has this an A tag. So what is the job of an A tag?
It's a link.
Yeah. So an A tag or an anchor tag, it's going to have a link. So we have an href. So we have a tag, right? So we have a tag. We can also have attributes. Tags can have attributes. So in this case, href, this is giving us the URL of. So if we click on here, we'll be redirected, obviously, to that URL. Okay. So we don't need to worry about I mean, there are like 100 or some HTML tags. We don't need to worry about all of them. This is 90+% of what you need to know. So let's just, let's go ahead and try making a copy of this site. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder or a file. This will be called index.html. So this is a standard convention. So like the basic HTML entry point for an application will be called index.html. And the HTML is just the structure. So if the first thing I'm going to do is operating in VS Code, there's a lot of boilerplate that you have to type with HTML. So to save yourself some trouble, you can type in exclamation mark, and you should get these Emmet abbreviations, and this will automatically give you a bunch of boilerplate, which is nice. So this doc type HTML, saying it's in English. Here's some meta information. This is all kind of standard stuff. But browsers are very good at parsing through bad HTML. So most of the time you'll get HTML pages that aren't complete, but browsers are good at dealing with that. So I'm gonna so I've got this kind of boilerplate, but it comes with a title. So I'm just going to run this. There's a few ways to do this. I like using Live Server, which is an extension you can download in VS Code. So I'm going to open this with Live Server. And you can see that there's nothing being displayed here. So I'm on localhost port 5500 and the index.html. So I can see that there's no text here, but this document. So this title is coming from here. So that's where a title will show up. I can change this. So this won't really display, but something like that. So I can change this, and this will change up here. So one of the benefits of using Live Server is that when you save, it will hot reload. Okay. So I've got my HTML. So this is kind of the largest unit that I have. Within the HTML, I have two nodes. So I could maybe tab these in to highlight that. So I have a head node and I have a body node. My head node, I'm basically not going to worry about right now. The body node, we can add a title just to make sure that everything's working. So I'm going to add H1 tag, and if I save this, I should get something here. And if I, instead of doing H1, I did H4 or something, it'll be a lot smaller. So they're kind of default settings. We can change all the properties of this with CSS, but these are defaults. So let's put this back to H1. Is there a question?
What was the name of the extension you used?
Emmet. It should.
Sorry, I meant to launch the browser.
Yes.
Running the browser.
Live server.
Okay, thank you.
It's by Ritwick. So let me just yeah, it should be this one. Live server by Ritwick Day.
And then what command did you use to start it?
You can just you can right click on the on whatever HTML file is the entry point for your application, and then open with live server. And then on the bottom here, when you want to stop it, you can close this down right here. Okay, so I've now got this. I've got my website up. So I'm on a local development server, of course. So let's try to copy this. So I can see example. I can one thing I can do is just look at this and try to eyeball it, which is okay, and that can work. But sometimes, depending on how complicated, this is a very simple website, so things can get a lot more complicated, but we can actually kind of cheat a little bit and use the developer tools to see what exactly is going on. So within the body, we can see that there's one outer div. So it's not really doing anything, but it's still there. So we can actually add that. Let's add that here. We'll have a div. Right, so now our body has one child, which is a div. There's nothing going on there, so we can keep going. So this div looks like 3 children. One is an H1. We just made that. So let's go ahead and add that. H1 and some auto completion there, but example domain. We save that. You can go back here and this updates. So now we have example domain. Okay. And again, we're not worried about, right now, we're not worried about what it looks like. We're not worried about fonts or colors or anything. We're just trying to get the structure. So just the HTML. So, okay, so we have a div, and then we have this H1 element, and then we have a p tag. So we're gonna have to create a p tag. We'll save this. So let's make a p tag here. Paste that in. Oops. So you don't have to indent it. There's no real white space sensitivity. It's, HTML is white space agnostic. But for your own sanity, it's good to have some formatting. So we can see that we have our H1 title, and then we have this paragraph tag. All right, and we also have a second paragraph tag. And that second paragraph tag contains an A tag. So let's add the second paragraph tag. And that is going to contain an A tag. And this A tag is going to have a couple things. So one, it's going to have basically some text that will display. So more information. And it's also got this attribute, which is an href. So it's href, and here is the link. So if I now save this, and go back to my copy, and I should be able to click on the link and go to that website. Are there any questions so far? Okay, so it looks like that's about it for the structure, the HTML. So of course, this doesn't really look like this, even though this is not, not very styled. So let's try to actually make it look like the original. Again, so we could eyeball it. We can also try to take a look at the CSS. So there are basically 3 ways that you can use CSS. The first way is inline. So if I want to have the H1 element, I'm gonna make the text color red, for example. So style. Don't worry about the specifics here. So if I do that, now my text will be red. Okay, so this is an inline style. I'm putting it directly in the HTML. And there are occasions when you want to do that, especially when you get to React. Something like this might be useful, but in general, this is not. In general, you want to keep your HTML separate from your CSS. So inline is one option that works. Another option is to use a style tag. So you can actually include a style tag here, which is what this site does. So it actually included, see this style tag. So within the head, there's a style tag, and it has an attribute called type, and the attribute is text CSS. And within that style tag, we just have a bunch of CSS. So you can also do that, but again, this is not really the recommended way. So the recommended way is to create a separate document. So let's see, CSS. So conventionally style or styles that CSS. And so what we can do now is we can start adding some styles. So this body, there are a few ways that you can target HTML elements using CSS. You can target them by their tag name. You can target them by a class name, which is an attribute. We'll see in a second. You can also target them by their ID, which is also a class name. We'll talk about what all of those things do. But for now, let's start with body. So I'm going to apply some setting to everything. So before I had this thing text red, so I'm going to make all of the text red. So the syntax looks very similar to an object. So we have, this is the element that you're targeting. In this case, it's an HTML tag. We have the curly brackets. And then we have whatever HTML property, and there are a whole bunch of HTML properties. Color, maybe poorly named color means text color. And then there are a few different ways of indicating color. You can use RGB, like this three number system. You can use hex values. And there's a certain number of string values, which are kind of come included. Okay, so if I save this, I'm telling everything in my body, everything in the body of this HTML document should have red text, but it doesn't have red text. So why doesn't it have red text? Anyone have any ideas?
You have to tell your index file to run this or something.
Yeah, exactly. So my HTML document doesn't know anything about the CSS document. These are just two kind of parallel things. So you need to tell your index.html to use the CSS file. And the way you do that is in the head. So within the head, you put, I always forget the syntax and I have to look this up, but what is it? Href should be just like a local thing. So styles.css. And there's one other thing. I'm just going to look it up. Link rel. Okay, so rel style sheet. Okay. So once I do that, so again, you can always look, you don't need to memorize this stuff, you can always look it up. So you just include another tag here in the head, and this is saying basically use this external style sheet for CSS. And when you do that, then all of the text within the body becomes red. And since CSS cascading style sheets, so the whole idea is that styles will just filter down or cascade down. So if I start at the body, even though I haven't said anything about paragraphs or H1 tags or anything, everything in the body will be red unless it encounters something later. So I can be more specific here and say, let's say H1. I only want H1s to be red. And if I added another H1 here, that would also be red. So if I'm targeting tags, HTML tags, then all of them, every H1 tag will fall under this. Okay, so that may or may not be what you want, but that's one way of doing it. Okay, so in addition to tags, we can also have classes. So let's say, there isn't a whole lot going on in this application, but let's say I wrap this in a, I don't know. Yeah, it's not a good example. All right, I'm just gonna add a class here. So, so this is an attribute we can add, and you pass it basically a string. So I'll say red, whatever. Let's call it red. And so I'm going to add a class to H1, this H1 tag, and to this P tag. So now, instead of just making every H1 red, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this class red. And notice that notice a slight difference here. It's dot red. So if you're referring to a class, it's red, whereas if you're referring to an HTML element, so So this is kind of strange. So I gave this h1 tag a class of red and this p tag a class of red. And so this color red is operating there. But then I am also saying, hey, all h1 elements, which would include this, need to be blue. So that, I mean, it looks like I'm not getting any errors or anything. So nothing's blowing up. Am I allowed to do this? Is this a problem? Does anyone know what's happening?
I think it's that class styles override tag styles. And I think for the future, ID styles override class styles.
Right, exactly. So there's a hierarchy here. So not only do styles filter down, but if there's a conflict, then depending on how it's implemented, one will override the other. So we're saying all h1 tags should be blue, but a class is regarded as basically like it will supersede any kind of general tag specification, right? So there's we can use tags, we can use classes, we can also use IDs. So let's make so classes are meant to be used. They're basically just labels. So class has nothing to do with like classes in Python. It's just a label, and you can have a given element could have several classes, several different classes, and it would just share all of those things. You can also have ID. So ID should be unique. That's the idea. It's not, uniqueness isn't enforced. So you can have a bunch of, a bunch of the same ID, but you should just, ID should be unique. So ID. Let's do, okay, so this p tag, now I've added another attribute, which is an ID. So if I go here and I do, what did I call it? Green ID. Green ID. Now, for the, maybe I should put these in different order. So this is, again, referring to an HTML element. This is referring to a class, so dot whatever is the class. And then for IDs, it's hashtag or whatever, pound, and then the thing. So this is how you tell CSS that this is an ID, this is a class, and this is just a tag. And the same thing. So what's going to happen when I save this? Well, I just saved it. So again, we have this this red, this class, right? So this h1 and this p tag both belong to this class red, which should make them both red. But this p tag also has an ID, this green ID, which says that the color should be green. So ID beats class, right? So class beats tag and ID beats class. There's also, whether you're using inline will actually beat styles defined in a style sheet as well. So it can get kind of complicated. If you have a very complicated application, that's something you'll have to pay more attention to. But in general, that's kind of the basics of how CSS works. So let's keep going, and we'll try to imitate this. All right. So we got a whole bunch of properties here: background color, I'm gonna delete all this stuff. Go in. All right, so the first style we have in the body. So body and background color. I'll copy this. There's a number of different ways you can indicate a color. This is one of them. Margin, padding. Okay, let's save this and take a look. So now we can see that the background color, it's it's a little bit gray. It's a light gray. So now everything in the body will have a background color of light gray. And notice this may not be obvious, but let me comment these out real quick. There's a slight, do you see a slight movement? So it's just to the right of the edge, and here it moves over, so it's touching the edge. So by default, there's a little bit of padding here. So you can basically, it's kind of like a way of like resetting. This is a thing you'll see, basically like reset everything to 0. And then here we have font family. So let me also mention that there are a number of different measurements, units of measurements. So there are two basic classes of measurements. One is absolute measurements, things like pixels, px. You can do centimeters. I mean, pixels is the most common one. If I save this, it's offset. I could do so now this is way over there. But so you can use pixels. This is the absolute measure. You can also use relative. There are a few relative measures. So EM is a relative measure, basically relative to the size of the font. So 1 EM is the size of the font, and 2 EM is double the font, and so on. So that's a relative measure. You can also do percent. So percent will be basically based on the parent element. So there are a number of different units you can use when doing this. So you can play around. CSS is full of experimenting and trial and error. So we've got the body here, the margin and the padding, the font family. So let's do that. The font family, I'm going to copy this. If I save this, so now the font is the same as what we've got here. It can also something like, so if I save this, then I get a new font. You can also, use external fonts. So there's Google Fonts. So you actually you just take you basically will add a tag to your head, and you can kind of import it and then use. So you're not limited to the fonts that kind of come by default. We'll use this for now. Okay. And then this div. So we're going to add another tag of div be width 600 px, margin 5 em. So you can mix relative and absolute measures. That's perfectly fine. Auto will basically just, depending on, so a lot of what you need to do when you're doing CSS is you manage what happens when the window size goes up and down. So auto can help with that. Padding 2 em and background color 2. Yeah, border radius. So there are a ton of properties, and you have to be careful when you're looking at them because things don't always do what you would expect based on a name. And box shadow, I'm just going to copy this. So this is starting to look, you know, a little bit more like that already. Can't even tell which one is the copy anymore. So the next thing is this. So this, we have an A and then a colon and a link. So this is actually what's called a pseudo class in CSS. So, you know, what happens when you click on a link, it will change color if you've already visited it before, right? So that's handled by this. So a.link, a.visited. So in this case, this app is designed in such a way that when you click on it, it doesn't change, right? So even though I've clicked on it, it's still the same color. So both a.visited and a.link or a colon link are the same. That's not necessarily all that common, but we'll enforce that. I'm going to paste this. So this color is the text color, text decoration. This is the line under, so text decoration of none. Basically, if I take this off, I should have that line underneath it. So for whatever reason, this is called text decoration. And now it's gone. And then here we have this, which looks a little bit more complicated. So this is what's called a media query. So oftentimes, again, you want to be responsive to the size of the window. So let me close this real quick. So I go right. So right here, so there's some kind of transition happening right there. Let me. You can see. Right. That's right there. And now this one will do it too. So if we didn't take this off, or if we didn't have this running, then we wouldn't get that transition. It would just keep doing whatever it's doing. But here we're saying basically, once it gets small enough, we're gonna reset the margins. So
how do you determine what size media, what the dimensions of the media query should be?
it just depends on your use case. So you can, it depends on how big. So this thing is, how big is this? 600. So once it's about to close in, then that's when the margins go away. You can also, the DevTools has like a phone emulator screen, basically, so you can see what your application would look like on a mobile device. So you can add a new media query here. Let's do let me just see if we have any large ones. So an iPad, for example. So you can kind of see how it might look in different devices. And so the first media query that's going to get hit, it will change the margins. And then the next media query, for no reason, will turn that page. So depending, so a lot of times you'll see like hamburger menus, right? So if, you know, a top nav bar might shift to the side depending on how wide the screen is. So that's how you control things like that. It's through media queries. All right. So I want to, so there are a lot of things you can do with CSS, obviously, and HTML, but especially CSS. So one of the major issues with CSS is basically like, how do you organize stuff? Like, how do you keep things centered? And this is a huge issue. Probably the best way of handling that is something called CSS Grid. We can talk about that a little bit. The challenges for today, there's a couple, I guess, you know, fun exercises you can do. CSS Grid. So let me show an example of that real quick. Are there any questions about what we've done so far? I'm just going to kind of expose you this topic, and you can do more of it later. All right. So I'm just going to make a whole bunch of, so CSS Grid allows you to kind of organize your viewport or your HTML document, the presentation in terms of like rows and columns. So so the typical structure for this is you'll have like a container element, and then you'll have like a bunch of items. So if you've ever seen, for example, like a bunch of cards, so you go to a website and there's a bunch of like cards with a picture and a description. It's like 5 or 6 of them in a row, something like that. So that's the kind of thing you can do with this. So I'm gonna create a div. And this is going to be a container div. So I'm going to give this a class container. This is arbitrary, but it's also kind of a common convention. And then I'm going to do a bunch of divs. So 1. All right, I think that should do it. So this is not very exciting, but we can use CSS to make this a lot more interesting. So what I want to do is basically get like 3 rows of 3. So I wanted to create a bunch of boxes that are 3 rows of 3. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my CSS and I'm going to add some stuff for this item class. So dot item, and I'm going to do oops. Sure. Okay, so these are all mushed together. So I'm going to add a a box. So border, and I'm going to make it 2 pixels thick, and the color be black, and then this is like the style, solid. So you can look up how this works. But so now I have a bunch of boxes here, and then I also would like to. They're all kind of like on top of each other, so I'd like to separate them out. So I can add a margin, and now they're all kind of separated from each other a little bit. And maybe, what is it? I think this is how you do that. Yeah, close enough. Okay, so I have all these boxes with numbers, but I don't want them. So with just HTML, right? With just HTML, these are stacked on top of each other. But I want them to be displayed. So there's no real way just with HTML. I mean, there is a way. You have to use like a table. This is how websites used to be laid out before. They would use tables. But we can do that with CSS now. So here's the item. So what we need to do now is, in order to use CSS Grid, is we have to add some CSS to this container class. And once we turn this container class into something that Grid can use, all of its direct descendants, all of its direct children will become part of it. So dot container, so Grid. So here, it's not Grid, it's display Grid. Display. Grid. So there's a slight change here, but basically nothing has happened because I haven't really told it specifically what to do yet. So I've kind of set this up. So now this is like, it's ready to be a grid, but I need to tell it basically the layout that it should have. So I can do this grid row. Actually, it's grid template. So we can set up let's set up the rows first, I guess. And so there are a few different ways of doing this. So what we're saying is basically like how many rows do I want to have, and how big should those rows be? And there are a few different measurements you could use. You can absolute measurements. You can also use relative measurements. And I'm going to use relative measurement, and there's one called FR, which is basically fractions. So this is just proportional. So 1 FR, 1 FR. And this means that these are all going to share. They're all going to be the same size. And I'm going to do grid template columns and do 1. And once I do that, you can see that we have a 3x3 grid. So that's the basics. We could do a couple more things, but just to show you that you can control the layout with the CSS. And if you're going to learn just one tool, I think CSS Grid. There's all kinds of other, like Flexbox and other things that you'll see, but I think sticking with CSS Grid is fine. It's kind of the single best tool. All right, so I think that's probably going to do it as a general introduction to HTML and CSS. So as you're doing the exercises, I would suggest not trying to just learn all of the HTML tags and all of the CSS properties and so on, but just kind of do stuff and then try to think, hey, wouldn't this be great if this were a different font, or how do I make the font bigger, or whatever it is that you're trying to do, and then just look up that specific thing. Are there any questions? So the exercises, let's see. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of challenges. It's unlikely you'll be able to get through all of them, but if you're interested in like CSS Grid, there's a couple kind of tutorial games you can play here, and then you can do some of these basic things. And I would try to maybe get to recreate Hacker News, at least get started. It doesn't have to be perfect, right? Just kind of start going through some of the motions of looking at what it is and how can I imitate that.